Billionaire came home unannounced. What he saw his fiancée doing to the maid made him furious. His next move shocked everyone. Vanessa Cole's arm rose high above her head, the leather crop cutting through the golden light of the marble foyer with a sound like a whip-crack of thunder. "You call this clean?" she screamed, and before Grace Bennett could even lift her hands to shield herself, the crop came down across her back. Grace's cry echoed off the crystal chandelier, off the gold-trimmed columns, off walls worth more than most people's houses. She didn't run. She didn't fight back. She simply pressed her forehead to the cold marble floor and endured it, the way she had learned to endure so many things in 30 years of a life that had never once been fair to her. What Vanessa didn't know, what she could never have imagined in that single, blazing moment of cruelty, was that the front door had opened silently behind her 3 minutes earlier. Julian Hale, the man she was set to marry in exactly 11 days, stood frozen in the doorway of his own home, briefcase still in hand, watching the woman he had chosen to spend his life with raise a whip against a woman who had done nothing but scrub his floors. He did not shout. He did not move. For a long, terrible moment, Julian Hale simply watched, his jaw tightening, his knuckles whitening around the handle of his briefcase, something inside him breaking and rebuilding itself all at once. And then, quietly, deliberately, he stepped back out onto the porch, closed the door without a sound, and pulled out his phone. What he did in the next 60 seconds would end one woman's engagement and change another woman's life forever. Grace Bennett had not always scrubbed other people's floors for a living. 3 years earlier, she had stood in front of a classroom of second graders in a small elementary school outside Cleveland. Chalk dust on her fingers and a whole future laid out ahead of her like a road she could actually see the end of. But life has a way of rerouting people without asking permission, and when her mother's kidneys began to fail and the medical bills started arriving faster than Grace could open them, teaching became a luxury she could no longer afford. She needed cash, and she needed it fast, and a housekeeping agency in Boston paid nearly triple what substitute teaching ever had. So she packed one suitcase, kissed her mother's forehead, and told her she'd be back before she knew it. She had been telling her that for 2 years now. Nobody watching this quiet woman drives to say it was so simple. She didn't know yet what waited for her behind those gates. The Hale estate sat on 11 acres outside Boston, a limestone mansion with more rooms than most hotels, and Grace had worked there for 4 months by the time this story truly begins. She woke before the sun every single day, tied her hair back the same way her mother had taught her, and moved through the house like a whisper, dusting portraits of ancestors who had never worked a day in their lives, polishing silver that cost more than her mother's entire hospital bill, scrubbing marble until she could see her own tired reflection staring back at her. She was good at her job. Better than good. The head housekeeper, an older woman named Dolores who had worked for the Hale family for nearly 20 years, often said Grace had the gentlest hands and the strongest work ethic she'd seen in a decade. "You're wasted here," Dolores told her once, watching Grace fold linens with the same careful precision she used to grade spelling tests. "You should be teaching somewhere. Somewhere they'd appreciate you." Grace only smiled and kept folding. She didn't tell Dolores about the calls home every Sunday night, her mother's voice growing thinner each week, or the number in her savings account that grew by exactly $400 every 2 weeks and never fast enough. She didn't tell anyone that she cried sometimes in the laundry room, quietly, into a towel that wasn't hers, so no one would hear. What she did tell people, when they asked why she stayed in a house that felt more like a cage than a home, was simple: every job has its difficult days. She had no idea yet how difficult those days were about to become. Julian Hale rarely crossed paths with the household staff. He left before 6 most mornings and returned well after dark, running a real estate empire that spanned 4 continents, a man whose photograph appeared in business magazines more often than his own reflection appeared in a mirror he had time to look into. He was polite when their paths did cross, always a nod, sometimes a thank you that most billionaires forgot to say. But he was, in Grace's eyes, simply the distant owner of a house she cleaned. A name on a paycheck. Nothing more. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that Julian had noticed her long before this story began. He had noticed the way she was the only staff member who always arrived early. He had noticed that she never complained, not once, even when Vanessa's demands grew unreasonable. He had noticed, in the particular way that quietly observant men notice things they cannot yet explain to themselves, that something about Grace Bennet felt different from everyone else who orbited his enormous, glittering, lonely life. But noticing is not the same as knowing. And what was coming would force him to learn the difference. Vanessa Cole had entered Julian's life 18 months earlier at a charity gala, dressed in a shade of red that made every other woman in the room disappear, and within 6 months she had a ring on her finger and a household staff of 12 under her command. She was beautiful in the way magazine covers are beautiful, sculpted, polished, engineered for admiration rather than warmth. And from the very first week she moved into the estate, something in the house changed. The staff noticed it before Julian did. The way Vanessa's voice sharpened the moment his car left the driveway. The way she inspected rooms with white gloves, searching for reasons to be displeased. The way Dolores, who had survived 20 years of demanding employers, began flinching whenever Vanessa's heels clicked against the marble. Grace noticed too. She noticed everything, the way people who have learned to survive difficult situations always do. And she noticed, with a growing unease she couldn't quite name, that Vanessa's eyes lingered on her longer than they lingered on the other staff. Something about Grace seemed to irritate Vanessa in a way that had nothing to do with dust or fingerprints on glass. She would understand why soon enough. But by then, the damage would already be done. The first real crack came on a Tuesday afternoon in March, 3 weeks before the wedding invitations were set to go out. Vanessa had hosted a luncheon for 6 of her closest friends, women with manicured hands and diamond earrings who spoke about vacation homes the way other people spoke about the weather, and Grace had spent the entire morning polishing the good silver, arranging fresh peonies in crystal vases, and pressing linen napkins until they held a crease sharp enough to cut paper. Everything had gone perfectly. Until dessert. One of Vanessa's friends, a woman named Beatrice with a laugh like breaking glass, had set her wine glass too close to the edge of the table, and it had tipped, spilling a dark red stain across the white tablecloth just as Grace was clearing the salad plates. It wasn't Grace's fault. Everyone at the table saw it happen. But the moment the wine hit the fabric, Vanessa's face transformed into something cold and furious, and before Grace could even reach for a napkin, Vanessa was on her feet. "Do you have any idea what that tablecloth cost?" Vanessa's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Do you have any idea how careless you are? I should dock your entire week's pay for this." Grace opened her mouth to explain, to gently point out that the glass had tipped on its own, that she had been 3 feet away, but something in Vanessa's expression stopped her. This wasn't really about the tablecloth. This was about something else entirely, something Grace couldn't yet see, and arguing would only make it worse. So she simply lowered her eyes, said "I'm so sorry," and began cleaning up a mess that wasn't hers to clean. Beatrice, to her credit, tried to intervene. "Vanessa, it was my glass, It's fine," Vanessa snapped, cutting her off, eyes never leaving Grace. "She needs to be more careful. That's all." That night, alone in the small staff quarters above the garage, Grace sat on the edge of her bed and allowed herself exactly 10 minutes to cry before she wiped her face, checked on the amount in her savings account, and reminded herself why she was still here. Her mother's dialysis appointments weren't going to pay for themselves. Dignity, she told herself, was a luxury she could not always afford. Not yet. Not until the debt was paid. She had no idea that Vanessa's cruelty that afternoon was only a preview. A small, cold taste of something far worse still waiting in the weeks ahead. By April, the household had become a place of quiet dread. Vanessa's mood swung without warning, and increasingly, Grace found herself the target of a hostility that made less and less sense with every passing week. She was reprimanded for dust that didn't exist. Accused of moving items she had never touched. Once, Vanessa claimed a pearl bracelet had gone missing from her dressing room and threatened to call the police before it turned up, hours later, exactly where Vanessa herself had left it, tangled in the folds of a silk scarf. There was no apology. There never was. Dolores tried to shield Grace when she could, taking on extra tasks herself, quietly warning her which rooms to avoid when Vanessa's temper seemed close to the surface. "She's testing you," Dolores whispered one evening in the kitchen, after Vanessa had reduced Grace to tears over a crooked picture frame. "I don't know why, but she's testing you specifically. I've never seen her fixate on someone like this." Grace didn't understand it either. She had done nothing to deserve this particular, personal cruelty. She kept her head down, worked twice as hard, arrived earlier, and left later, hoping that if she simply became invisible enough, Vanessa's attention would drift elsewhere. It never did. Meanwhile, her mother's health was declining faster than the doctors had predicted. A phone call in the second week of April delivered the kind of news that makes the ground feel unstable beneath your feet. Her mother's kidney function had dropped again, and a transplant, once a distant hypothetical, was now being discussed as a real and urgent necessity. The number attached to that word, transplant, made Grace's stomach turn to ice. It was a sum so large it might as well have been printed in a foreign currency, unreachable no matter how many double shifts she worked. She began picking up extra hours cleaning a neighboring estate on her one day off, sacrificing what little rest she had left, running herself thinner and thinner in a race against a clock she couldn't see or slow down. She stopped calling her sister back. She stopped answering messages from old teaching friends who wondered when she'd return to Cleveland. Her entire world had narrowed down to a single, exhausting question. How do I make enough money fast enough to save her? She had no way of knowing that the answer to that question was closer than she thought, and that it would arrive from the last place she expected. Vanessa's obsession with Grace deepened in ways that felt increasingly irrational, and by early May, even the other staff had begun to whisper about it. It was Dolores who finally connected the pieces, late one night while helping Grace polish silver in the kitchen after Vanessa had gone to bed. "I saw something today," Dolores said quietly, glancing toward the hallway to make sure they were alone. Mr. Hale was going through old photographs in his study. "Looking for something for the wedding slideshow, I think." And Vanessa walked in and saw one of the photos over his shoulder, and her whole face changed. She grabbed the album and said she'd handle the slideshow herself. Grace frowned, setting down the fork she'd been polishing. "What was in the photo?" Dolores hesitated. "I only saw it for a second. It was Mr. Hale, years younger, at some kind of charity event. And standing beside him was a woman who looked a lot like you, Grace. A lot like you." The words settled over Grace like a strange, cold weight, though she couldn't have explained why. She had no memory of ever meeting Julian Hale before coming to work in his house. She had certainly never attended a charity event with a man worth billions. But something about Dolores's words lodged itself in her mind and refused to leave, a small splinter of a question she wouldn't find the answer to for weeks still. She thought about asking Vanessa directly. She thought better of it almost immediately. Whatever this was, drawing more of Vanessa's fury toward herself felt like the last thing her exhausted body and her dwindling bank account could survive right now. She had no idea that the answer to Dolores's mystery was about to explode into the open in the worst possible way, and that it would take everything from her before it gave anything back. The morning it happened started like any other. Grace arrived at 5:30, made her rounds through the East Wing, and was midway through scrubbing the grand staircase when Vanessa descended it in a fury, waving a phone in her hand like a weapon. "You went through my things," Vanessa hissed, storming toward Grace with an expression Grace had never seen before. Not irritation, not impatience, but something closer to panic wearing the mask of rage. "My private messages. Someone accessed my phone last night, and you were the only one in this wing." Grace rose slowly to her feet, hands still damp from the bucket beside her, utterly bewildered. I would never. I don't even know your passcode. I've never touched your phone." "Don't lie to me." Vanessa's voice climbed to a pitch that echoed off the marble, and something in her eyes had gone glassy and wild, the look of a woman cornered by a truth she wasn't ready to face. What Grace couldn't know was that Vanessa's panic had nothing to do with a hacked phone at all. It had everything to do with a text message she had received the night before from a man named Marcus, a man Vanessa had been secretly seeing for the past 4 months, a man whose existence would unravel everything the moment it came to light. In her paranoia, in the desperate math of a woman trying to protect a secret, Vanessa had convinced herself that someone, anyone, must be closing in, and the maid kneeling 3 feet away made the easiest possible target. "I have done nothing," Grace said again, quietly, firmly, the closest she had come in months to standing up for herself. "I would never invade your privacy." It was the wrong thing to say, or perhaps it was simply the spark that finally lit a fuse that had been burning for weeks. Vanessa's hand moved before either of them fully registered it. A sharp slap across Grace's cheek that echoed through the entire foyer. The silence afterward was worse than the sound itself. Grace stood frozen, one hand rising slowly to her stinging cheek, tears she refused to let fall burning behind her eyes. Somewhere down the hallway, she heard Dolores's sharp intake of breath, though neither woman moved to intervene. And Vanessa, breathing hard, staring at her own hand as though it belonged to someone else, seemed for a single moment to understand exactly how far she had gone. But instead of apologizing, instead of retreating, something in Vanessa hardened further. "Get back to work," she said coldly, turning on her heel and walking away as though nothing had happened at all. That night, for the first time in 2 years, Grace considered quitting. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed with her phone in her hands, her mother's number pulled up on the screen, her thumb hovering over the call button. She wanted to hear her mother's voice. She wanted, more than anything, to be told it would be okay to walk away. But she looked at the number in her savings account instead, still thousands of dollars short of what the transplant would cost, and she put the phone down, wiped her face, and told herself she could survive 2 more weeks. Just 2 more weeks, until the next paycheck, until she had a little more cushion, until she had some kind of plan. She had no idea that in less than 2 weeks, everything, her job, her safety, her entire future, would collapse and rebuild itself in a single, unforgettable afternoon. The days that followed the slap were the darkest Grace had experienced since arriving in Boston. Vanessa's behavior grew more erratic by the day, swinging between icy silence and sudden eruptions of temper that left Grace flinching at every closing door. Dolores, terrified of losing her own position after 20 years of service, grew quieter, more cautious, less able to offer the small protections she once had. The other staff began avoiding Grace altogether, as though her presence alone might draw Vanessa's fury toward them by association. Isolation, Grace was learning, was its own particular kind of cruelty. Worse still, a phone call from her sister on a Thursday evening delivered the news Grace had been dreading for weeks. Their mother had been moved to intensive monitoring. The transplant list was moving faster than expected, which should have been good news, except that the family still hadn't come close to raising the funds required for a procedure not fully covered by insurance. "I don't know what we're going to do," her sister said, her voice cracking over the phone. "I don't know how we're going to afford this, Grace." Grace didn't know either. She stayed up long after midnight that night, sitting on the floor of her small room with a legal pad and a pen, trying to calculate impossible numbers, trying to find some combination of extra shifts and skipped meals and sold belongings that might somehow bridge the gap between what she had and what she needed. There wasn't one. No matter how many times she ran the math, the answer stayed the same. It wasn't enough, and it wasn't going to be enough in time. She thought, briefly, desperately, about asking Julian Hale directly for an advance on her salary. She had barely spoken more than a few sentences to the man in 4 months, and the thought of approaching him, a man whose net worth she couldn't fully comprehend, a man engaged to the woman who had slapped her 3 days earlier, felt impossible. What would she even say? How would she explain herself without sounding like exactly the kind of scheming, opportunistic person Vanessa already seemed to believe she was? She decided against it. She told herself she would find another way. She always had before. She had no idea that Julian Hale had already begun quietly investigating something that would change everything. Not because of Grace's mother, not because of money at all, but because of a single photograph he couldn't stop thinking about, and a question that had been gnawing at him for weeks. It happened on a Friday afternoon in the third week of May, exactly 11 days before the wedding, on a day that began with no warning of the storm about to break. Vanessa had spent the morning in a mood darker than Grace had ever seen. Pacing the halls, snapping at everyone who crossed her path, her phone clutched in her hand as though it might explode. What none of the staff knew was that Marcus, the man Vanessa had been secretly seeing, had called that morning threatening to tell Julian everything unless she gave him the money she'd promised weeks earlier. Money Vanessa didn't have, because every dollar of her own inheritance had already been spent maintaining an image she could no longer afford. Panic, cornered and desperate, had turned into something uglier than either emotion alone. Grace was polishing the base of the grand staircase, entirely unaware of any of it, when Vanessa descended the stairs and found a single smudge on the marble, a smudge that hadn't been there an hour earlier, left by nothing more than the sole of someone's shoe passing through. Something in Vanessa broke entirely. "You did this on purpose," she screamed, and before Grace could even rise from her knees, Vanessa had crossed to the small decorative table near the entryway, snatched up a riding crop that had been left there as part of an equestrian-themed display, and raised it high above her head. The first strike caught Grace across the shoulder, so sudden and so violent that she cried out and fell forward, catching herself on her hands. Please," she gasped, but Vanessa wasn't listening anymore. Whatever thin thread of control had been holding Vanessa together for weeks had finally snapped, and years of buried panic and desperation poured out of her in the worst possible direction, onto the one person too powerless to stop it. "You call this clean?" Vanessa screamed, the crop coming down a second time. "You ungrateful, careless." Grace pressed herself down toward the floor, arms curling instinctively over her head, humiliation and pain and disbelief crashing over her all at once. This wasn't discipline. This wasn't even the cruelty she had grown accustomed to over the past months. This was something else entirely, something that made the other staff who witnessed it freeze in the doorways, too frightened to intervene, too afraid of losing their own positions to step between Vanessa and the woman kneeling on the marble. What none of them knew, what not even Vanessa knew, was that the front door had opened silently exactly 90 seconds earlier. Julian Hale had come home early, planning to surprise Vanessa with news about a change to their wedding venue, and instead he stood frozen in his own foyer, briefcase still in his hand, watching a scene that would be burned into his memory for the rest of his life. He watched the crop rise a third time. He watched Grace's shoulders curl inward, bracing for another blow. And in that single, suspended moment, something in Julian Hale, something patient and careful and controlled, something that had spent 45 years learning to keep his emotions locked safely behind glass, shattered completely. But he did not shout. He did not lunge forward. Instead, with a stillness that would have terrified anyone who truly knew him, he stepped backward, silent as a shadow, and closed the front door without a sound. He had seen enough. And he already knew exactly what he was going to do. Julian stood on his own porch for nearly a full minute, breathing slowly, deliberately, forcing the roar in his chest into something he could control. This was not a moment for rage, he told himself. Rage made mistakes. This was a moment for precision. He pulled out his phone and made 2 calls in quick succession. The first was to his head of household security, instructing him to pull every camera feed from the foyer, dating back 6 months, and to have it ready within the hour. The second call was to his personal attorney, a woman named Patricia Voss who had handled Julian's affairs for over a decade and had never once heard the particular tone in his voice that she heard now. "I need you at the house in 20 minutes, Julian said. "Bring the prenuptial documents. All of them." Only then did he open the front door again, this time deliberately loud enough to announce his arrival, calling out a casual "I'm home" as though he had just walked in for the very first time. He found Vanessa in the sitting room, the riding crop nowhere in sight, her expression rearranged into the polished, pleasant mask she wore whenever Julian was near. "Darling, you're early," she said, crossing the room to kiss his cheek as though nothing at all had happened 20 feet away, moments before. Julian let her kiss him. He smiled, even, a smile that cost him more effort than closing a $1 billion acquisition. "I finished early," he said smoothly. "Thought I'd surprise you." He asked about her day. He listened to her talk about wedding preparations, about flowers and seating charts and a caterer she was considering replacing. And the entire time, some small, controlled part of his mind was calculating, planning, preparing. He excused himself 20 minutes later to check on something in his study. And it was there, alone, door locked, that he finally allowed himself to sit down and truly absorb what he had witnessed. He thought of Grace, quiet, careful Grace, who had never once complained in 4 months, who arrived earlier than anyone and left later than everyone, who he had noticed, in small unspoken ways, was different from every other person who moved through his enormous, glittering house. He thought of the crop rising above her back. He thought of the sound she made when it landed. And then, almost involuntarily, his mind returned to a photograph he had found 3 weeks earlier while searching through old albums for the wedding slideshow. A photograph from a charity gala nearly 8 years ago, himself much younger, standing beside a woman whose face had stopped him cold the moment he saw it. He had shown it to Vanessa, asking if she recognized the woman, some vague itch of memory he couldn't quite place, and Vanessa had snatched the album from his hands with a strange, sharp urgency, insisting she'd handle the slideshow herself. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. He thought of nothing else now. He opened his laptop, pulled up the security footage his head of security had already sent over, and began, methodically, to build a case, not just against Vanessa Cole, but toward an answer to a question that had been sitting, unexamined, in the back of his mind for weeks. Who exactly was Grace Bennett, and why did some quiet, persistent part of him feel as though he already knew her? The footage confirmed everything Julian had witnessed and more. It showed months of small cruelties he hadn't known were happening under his own roof. Vanessa's cold dismissals, her manufactured accusations, the slap 3 days earlier that Julian watched with his hands clenched into fists on his desk, and finally, the scene from that very afternoon, captured in full, undeniable detail. He watched it twice. He needed to be certain, needed the anger to settle into something colder and more useful than shock. Then he turned to the second mystery, the photograph. He spent 2 hours that evening searching through old event records, guest lists, and archived press photos from the gala 8 years earlier, cross-referencing names until, finally, he found it. The woman in the photograph beside him had been listed as a guest of a former business partner, a scholarship fundraiser he had barely remembered attending. Her name, according to the archived program, was Eleanor Bennett. Julian sat back slowly in his chair. Bennett. The same last name as the maid currently sleeping in the staff quarters above his garage, unaware that her employer was, at this very moment, 3 rooms away, unraveling a connection neither of them had ever known existed. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he made a series of careful, quiet calls to the scholarship fund's old records office, to a private investigator he trusted completely, piecing together a story that, by sunrise, had rearranged itself into something he could hardly believe. Eleanor Bennett, it turned out, had been a teacher who, nearly 9 years earlier, had personally written to Julian's now-deceased mother, then chairwoman of a small educational charity, pleading for funding to keep an after-school program alive in a struggling Cleveland neighborhood. A program that had, according to the records, changed the trajectory of dozens of children's lives, including, the investigator's report noted almost as an afterthought, that of Eleanor's own daughter, a bright young student who had gone on, years later, to become a teacher herself. Julian stared at the name in the final line of the report for a long time before he fully absorbed it. Grace Bennett. The woman currently cleaning his floors was the daughter of a woman his own mother had once quietly helped, years before either of them could have known their paths would cross again in a mansion outside Boston, under circumstances neither could have imagined. He thought of his mother, gone now for 6 years, and the quiet, unglamorous causes she had poured her heart into. Never seeking credit, never publicizing her generosity, simply believing, as she'd told Julian 100 times growing up, that real character was what you did when no one important was watching. He thought of Grace kneeling on his marble floor, and he understood, with sudden and complete clarity, exactly what he needed to do next. The following morning, Julian did something he had not done in the 4 months Grace had worked in his home. He asked to see her directly. Grace arrived at the study with her heart pounding, certain she was about to be fired, certain, perhaps, that Vanessa had finally succeeded in turning her employer against her entirely. She stood in the doorway, hands folded, bracing herself for the worst. Instead, Julian rose from behind his desk, gestured to the chair across from him, and said, quietly, "Please, sit down. I owe you an explanation, and an apology, and I don't quite know where to begin." Grace sat, cautiously, unsure what to make of the gentleness in his voice. "I was home yesterday afternoon," Julian said, watching her face carefully. "Earlier than I told anyone. I saw what happened on the staircase." The color drained from Grace's face. Every instinct told her to deny it, to protect herself, to say it was a misunderstanding, the way she had learned to smooth over every previous cruelty in this house. "Sir, You don't need to explain anything," Julian said gently. "I saw it. I have it on camera, in fact, along with several other incidents I was not previously aware of. And I want you to know, before anything else, that none of that was acceptable, and none of it will happen again." Grace didn't know how to respond. In 4 months, no one in this house had ever spoken to her with this particular kind of directness, this careful, deliberate respect. She felt tears pressing against her eyes and forced them back, unwilling to fall apart in front of the man who owned this entire estate. "There's something else," Julian continued. "Something I only discovered last night. Does the name Eleanor Bennett mean anything to you?" Grace blinked, startled. "That's my mother's name." Julian nodded slowly, and then, carefully, he told her everything. The photograph, his mother's charity, the letter Eleanor had written 9 years earlier, the scholarship fund that had, in some small, tangled, unknowable way, helped shape the life Grace had built for herself before illness and circumstance had rerouted it. He watched her face as the pieces settled into place, watched disbelief soften into something closer to overwhelmed recognition. "My mother believed in your mother's work," Julian said quietly. "She believed in it enough to fund it for years, quietly, without ever asking for credit. I had no idea, until 3 weeks ago, that the daughter she helped indirectly support was the same woman working in my own home. I don't believe in fate, Grace. But I don't believe in this kind of coincidence either." Grace sat in stunned silence, trying to process a truth so large it didn't fit easily inside the exhausted, careful shape her life had taken over the past 2 years. "I don't understand what any of this means," she finally said. "It means," Julian said, "that I am done pretending I haven't noticed the kind of person you are. And it means Vanessa Cole is no longer welcome in this house." Grace left that meeting in a daze, uncertain what to feel, uncertain what any of it truly changed. She still had a mother in a hospital bed. She still had a savings account thousands of dollars short of what she needed. Kindness from a billionaire, however sincere, didn't erase medical bills or undo months of humiliation. But something had shifted, undeniably, and over the following days, Grace found herself watching Julian differently, not as a distant name on a paycheck, but as a man capable of quiet, careful attention, a man who, she was beginning to realize, had been paying far closer attention to the people in his own house than she ever imagined. Vanessa, for her part, seemed entirely unaware that anything had changed. She continued planning the wedding with the same brittle, anxious energy, unaware that Julian's attorney had already begun quietly reviewing the prenuptial agreement, unaware that the security footage from the past 6 months sat waiting in a locked drawer in Julian's study, unaware that her secret arrangement with Marcus was about to become the least of her problems. Julian moved carefully, deliberately, refusing to let his anger rush him into a mistake. He gathered every piece of evidence. He met with Patricia Voss twice more that week, reviewing every legal detail. And he began, in small quiet ways, ensuring Grace's life became a little easier, an unexpected raise processed through payroll with no explanation attached, a note left with the household accountant authorizing an advance on her salary should she ever need one, though he never once mentioned it to her directly, unwilling to make her feel like the recipient of charity rather than the professional she had always been. Grace noticed the raise. She stared at her pay stub for a long time, unsure what to make of it, before deciding, cautiously, gratefully, to simply accept the unexpected relief it offered. She transferred the extra amount directly into the fund for her mother's care, watching the impossible number on her calculation sheet shrink, just slightly, for the first time in months. She had no idea Julian had authorized it. She had no idea, yet, how much further his quiet intervention was about to go. Nor did she know that Vanessa, growing increasingly desperate under Marcus's mounting threats, was about to make a decision so reckless it would bring everything crashing down in front of the very guests gathered for what was supposed to be her wedding day. The truth came out 9 days later, at the rehearsal dinner, in front of nearly 80 guests gathered in the grand ballroom of the estate. Julian had planned it carefully, not out of cruelty, he told himself, but out of necessity. Vanessa needed to understand, completely and publicly, that her behavior had consequences, that money and beauty and charm could not indefinitely shield someone from accountability. He had spent the past week quietly informing his closest family and business associates that the wedding would not be proceeding as planned, without yet revealing the full reason why, wanting the truth to unfold on his own terms, at a time and place he controlled. Vanessa stood at the center of the ballroom, glowing in a cream-colored gown, entirely unaware that her carefully constructed world was about to collapse. She was midway through a toast, thanking their guests for their support, when Julian rose from his seat, walked calmly to the front of the room, and asked, gently but firmly, if he could say a few words of his own. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," he began, his voice steady despite the storm behind his eyes. "Many of you have known me for years. Some of you knew my mother, and you know how much she valued honesty and character above everything else, above money, above status, above appearances. She taught me that the truest measure of a person is how they treat someone who has no power over them." Vanessa's smile faltered, just slightly, though she kept it fixed in place. "9 days ago," Julian continued, "I came home early and witnessed something in this house that I will never forget. A member of my staff, a woman who has done nothing but work with dignity and grace since the day she arrived, was struck, repeatedly, by my fiancé. It was not the first time Vanessa had mistreated her. It was simply the first time I saw it with my own eyes." A ripple of shocked murmurs moved through the room. Vanessa's face had gone pale, her hands beginning to tremble around the stem of her champagne glass. "Julian, this isn't the time," she started, but he continued, his voice calm and unwavering. "I also learned, this past week, that Vanessa has been engaged in a relationship with another man for the past 4 months. A man she has been paying, using money that was never hers to spend, to keep quiet about debts she never disclosed to me. I have the documentation. My attorney has reviewed everything." The room had gone utterly silent, 80 pairs of eyes locked on Vanessa, whose composure had finally, completely, shattered. "How dare you humiliate me like this?" she hissed, but her voice cracked in a way that betrayed her, the panic she had been suppressing for weeks finally breaking through in front of everyone she had spent months trying to impress. "I'm not interested in humiliating anyone," Julian said quietly. "I'm interested in the truth. And the truth is, this wedding is not happening. Not tomorrow. Not ever." He turned then, and asked one of the staff standing near the entrance to bring Grace into the room. She entered hesitantly, still in her work uniform, utterly bewildered, having had no idea what Julian was planning. The room's attention shifted toward her, and for a moment, Grace felt every instinct urging her to disappear, to retreat back into the invisibility she had worked so hard to maintain. But Julian crossed the room, stood beside her, and said, simply, to everyone gathered, "This is Grace Bennett. She has shown more grace, more strength, and more dignity in the past 4 months than most people demonstrate in a lifetime. I intend to make sure everyone in this house understands exactly how she deserves to be treated, starting tonight." Vanessa did not go quietly. She screamed accusations, called Julian cruel and vindictive, insisted the staff member was lying, insisted the affair was a fabrication, insisted, until the very end, that she was the victim in a story where the evidence told an entirely different truth. Security eventually escorted her from the property while she was still shouting, her cream-colored gown trailing behind her across the same marble floor where, 9 days earlier, she had raised a whip against a woman kneeling in front of her. The guests dispersed slowly, murmuring, stunned, but Julian found, in the days that followed, that most of them respected him more for what he had done than they ever had before. Wealth, he had learned long ago, brought a great deal of admiration. Character, apparently, still brought a little more. Grace, meanwhile, found herself in a position she couldn't have imagined even a month earlier. Julian insisted on personally covering the remaining costs of her mother's transplant, not as charity, he told her firmly, but as a long-overdue debt repaid, given everything his own mother had once quietly done for her family without ever expecting anything in return. Grace resisted at first, her pride bristling at the idea of accepting something so enormous, but Julian was patient and gentle and utterly unwilling to let pride stand in the way of her mother's life. "Let me do this," he told her simply, one evening in the quiet of his study. "Not because I feel sorry for you. Because you deserve it, and because I finally have the chance to do something my mother would be proud of." Grace's mother received her transplant 6 weeks later, in a hospital in Cleveland, with Grace at her bedside the entire time. When she woke from surgery, weak but stable, the first thing she asked her daughter was whether she was still working too hard, still sacrificing too much of herself for other people. Grace, through tears of relief, promised her mother she was finally, for the first time in years, exactly where she was supposed to be. The relationship between Grace and Julian did not rush forward. Neither of them wanted it to. It grew slowly, carefully, built on months of quiet mutual respect rather than the sudden, dramatic urgency that had defined Julian's relationship with Vanessa. He asked about her days. She began, cautiously, to ask about his. They discovered, over long conversations in the study that stretched later and later into the evenings, that they shared more than either of them had expected. A belief in quiet dignity over loud ambition, a discomfort with unearned attention, a deep respect for the kind of character that reveals itself only when no one important is watching. Dolores, watching it all unfold from the sidelines, told Grace one evening, with a knowing smile, that she had seen this particular kind of quiet transformation happen exactly once before in her 20 years at the estate. With Julian's own parents, decades earlier, a marriage built on the same slow, patient foundation. Grace didn't know yet where things between her and Julian would ultimately lead. But for the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope for something beyond survival, beyond the next paycheck, beyond simply getting through another difficult day. A year later, Grace stood in the same marble foyer where everything had once gone so terribly wrong, though the room felt entirely different now. She had returned to teaching, part-time at first, working with children at a community program Julian had helped fund in her honor. A program built, fittingly, on the same principles Eleanor Bennett had once fought so hard to protect in Cleveland nearly a decade earlier. Her mother, healthy and strong again, had flown in for the occasion, standing proudly beside her daughter, marveling at how far this quiet, hard-working woman had come. Dolores still worked at the estate, though her role had shifted. She managed the household now with an authority and respect she had never quite been granted under Vanessa's brief, difficult reign. The other staff, once too frightened to speak up, moved through the halls now with an ease that Grace remembered longing for during her hardest months in this house. Julian stood beside her that afternoon, watching the same staircase where he had once witnessed the worst moment of his engagement collapse into cruelty, now transformed into something else entirely. A place where his own life, quietly and unexpectedly, had been rebuilt from the ground up. He thought often, in the months that followed, about the lesson his mother had tried to teach him his entire life, the one he hadn't fully understood until he watched a woman being struck in his own foyer and realized, in that single unbearable moment, exactly what kind of man he wanted to be. Character isn't what you show the world when everyone is watching. It's what you do, quietly, consistently, without an audience, for the people who have no power to reward or punish you for it. Grace had shown that character every single day she worked in his house, long before anyone noticed, long before anyone rewarded her for it. And Julian had learned, in the end, that the truest wealth he possessed had nothing to do with the 11 acres, the marble floors, or the fortune attached to his name. It was measured instead in the quiet, unglamorous moments of decency, the ones that mattered most precisely because no one important was watching. If there is one thing this story leaves behind, it is this. Kindness offered without expectation has a way of finding its way back to you, sometimes from the last place you'd ever think to look. Dignity is never wasted, even when it feels invisible. And the people who treat others with respect when no one is watching are always, in the end, the ones worth watching most closely. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If it moved you, if it made you feel something, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe for more stories like this one, and leave a comment telling us which part touched you most. Your support means more than you know, and it helps stories like Grace's reach the people who need them most.